I see the screen?
Yep, we sure can.
All right, good, good.
Welcome to Southern Maryland's Audubon's presentation for this month on common terns, uncommon information about them discovered by our Vice President Ben Springer and some of his colleagues in research. Um, Ben Springer is a graduate of St. Mary's College. In fact, he was a summa cum laude graduate this past year, has great experience with birds, and is going to talk about his research. For those of you tuning in that may be unfamiliar with Southern Maryland Audubon, we offer bird walks and workshops all across Southern Maryland throughout the year. We have the Christmas bird count coming up in December, and if folks are interested in joining that, you can reach out to us. Also, we have these monthly nature talks. And if you are a master naturalist, our monthly nature talks can go toward your continuing education hours. So, Ben, without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to you to give a more detailed introduction of yourself and to start the program.
All right, sounds good. Thanks for the introduction, Molly. I'm Ben Springer. I'm a recent graduate, as you said, from St. Mary's, and this is which was my SMP, my senior experience research. To get my bachelor's degree was uh, partly doing this project, working with Terns, and uh, basically it all started um, when I was working for 3 summers at Patuxent River Naval Air Station as an intern for bird surveys, which was mainly focused on the atlas, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, the breeding bird atlas. And over the course of the 3 years that I was there, the 3 summers from 2021 to 2023, I discovered that this fishing pier had terns, mostly common terns and royal terns, with bands on their legs that I could identify with the camera, which are called PFR, plastic field readable bands. Before I get into nitty gritty, I want to say that I appreciate everybody for coming out tonight, and I hope that you enjoy this presentation. It's been a long time coming. I've been looking forward to doing this, and I'm glad to have the support of everybody with Audubon. And if everybody's ready, I'm ready to dive in. We all good?
Go for it. We're all set.
All right. So, demographics of common terns at a newly identified staging site in Chesapeake Bay. So, here's to getting excited about terns. Yay! All right. So, how my research started? As I said, I was working at the Pax River Naval Air Station for 3 summers, doing mostly breeding bird surveys. But as it happened, checking this pier coming down, which, if those are not familiar with Patuxent River Naval Air Station, it's in St. Mary's County. It's a pretty well known location. The peninsula comes up at the confluence of the Patuxent River and the Chesapeake Bay. And along the bay side, there's a Patuxent River, the Goose Creek Campground, which has an associated fishing pier within the bay. And it just so happens that a lot of seabirds find this location very favorable and will come in large flocks and rest on this pier. And when I was working as a bird surveyor for those 3 years, starting in 2021, I discovered that there would be large flocks whenever I drive past, sitting on the railings. So, of course, I would get out and see what was up, as a birder would do. And come to find out, when you look at each bird individually, paying close attention to their legs, you can see that some of them are banded, which I mean, many people are familiar with banding, but generally, if it's a federal band, the metal bands, you can't read them without capturing the bird. So from seeing it from a distance doesn't do any good as far as research. But I noticed that many of them had plastic field readable bands, which I'll get into what that means, and the purpose of using them. But basically, what that meant was that I could identify individual birds by a 3-digit code on this plastic band that would correspond to their banding history. And after 3 years of collecting this data, because we had this unusual location with large numbers of species that are generally not found in large numbers outside of breeding colonies, um, at least not in this sort of scenario where you can actually get this many bands. I discovered that I could use this data that I collected to make this project for my school for my bachelor's degree. And going onward with this, I of course would go out on the pier with my Nikon camera, zoom into the legs one by one, and pick out the codes. And from the course of these 3 years, I picked out over 300 individual terns using this pier at one point in time. And some of them were repeats over multiple years, but we'll get into that. So identifying a PFR band, as you can see here, the chicks are banded on nesting colonies in several locations within the region. Particularly, there's Poplar Island, which is where we'll get to a lot of these terns are coming from. But also Rip Raps Island in the mouth of the James River, as well as some other stations that catch adult terns and band them along the East Coast. That goes up to New England and the coastal part of Maryland, Worcester County, etc., and also the Delmarva Peninsula section of Virginia. So over the course of the 3 years, 368 individuals, unique individuals, were detected from surveying this pier. And when you submit these 3-digit codes to the USGS bird banding lab, which holds the data of where each one of these bands were put on, and when you report each individual band, you'll receive the information from where that bird was coming from. So, for example, on this individual, we have a male who was born in 2021 or earlier, which indicates that this was caught as an adult rather than as a chick. And the location was Worcester County and was banded by Dave Brinker. And you can see that I encountered this bird in July of 2023. And with this information, it's valuable to see where these individuals are traveling from. And with these PFR bands, which you can see on a chick, this is one from Poplar Island, it's pretty obvious to see these 3-digit codes. And each code is linked to the federal band and can show a lot of information about where these chicks are coming from, and as they mature, how long they'll live, and very other information about their demographics. So staging behavior, you've seen that this is about a staging site. So what does staging mean? So staging is when flocks of birds, or doesn't necessarily have to be flocks, but in the case of terns, it's where birds will congregate and feed on high quality habitat prior to migration and during migration. And the purpose of this is to gain the resources they need to make long distance travel. And as common terns are highly migratory, they need to have these locations to get the energy they need to make these long flights. Because as you can imagine, being a bird and traveling these long distances is has a high toll on their bodies, and a high toll on, it's a dangerous pursuit to travel these long distances. So having a place that they can stop and use a location that they can sit and rest along the way, where they have access to good fishing grounds, can be a very useful thing. And we need to figure out where these locations are, and more research can be done to see, because a lot of focus has been done on the nesting grounds and nesting habitats, but birds are using habitats throughout the year, not just where they nest, and those are important as well. So it's important to get information on where they are spending all parts of their lives rather than just one part, especially for species as migratory as the common tern is. So the common tern is a pretty charismatic bird, fairly well known in Maryland, though it is not as common as might be expected based on the name. At least within our population, it is a state rare nester, and it's listed as endangered for Maryland. But it's a small seabird related to gulls. They primarily eat small fish and will dive. Uh, to, not they're not like plunge divers in the case of like a cormorant, but they'll dive from the air to catch small fish at the surface. And like I said, they're an endangered nester for the state of Maryland, and primarily only nest on islands. There are some projects on um, the ocean front of Maryland with floating nest islands specifically tailored for common terns, which are another location where banding is done. But primarily they're nesting on islands. And some of the locations that they formerly nested on no longer exist. There were some sand islands near Smith Island where banding had occurred in the past, but those no longer exist. So it's very much um, a species that relies on the lack of predators on an island habitat to increase their population because they aren't able to defend against mammalian predators as well as a bird that say nests in a tree because they don't have the capacity to nest anywhere besides open sand. And as a lot of birds that have this survival strategy have been facing with increased numbers of mammalian predators, it's more and more difficult. So these island habitats are very important to the protection of the species. And like I said, they are long distance migrants. You can see on this the range map. They go very far south, all the way into Central and South America, as far as Argentina. So, like I was saying before, for a species that has this wide of a distribution, protecting just the breeding grounds is just one piece of the puzzle. So, all these migration stops and wintering locations are vital to the conservation of a species like this. So, now we get into the juicy stuff. Where did all the terns that we identified on the pier come from? So, here's a map of all the unique individual terns from the 3 years that were cited on this pier. So, pretty overwhelming majority were from Poplar Island, which is the largest colony of common terns within the Chesapeake Bay. So that makes sense. And it's also the closest and directly north from the banding or the fishing pier that they are using as a staging site. So as these birds are leaving the nesting colony at Poplar Island, they are flying south towards the mouth of the bay and um, are picked up by me if I'm surveying as they're stopping over at this site. So most of them were banded as chicks in nesting colonies, but there were some that were banded as adults, and that's especially for these coastal locations: Monomoy National Wildlife Refuge, New Jersey, Ocean County. All of these were only adult birds. So the nesting, there were not juveniles that were banded here and then. So we don't know where they came from initially as far as where their nesting colony is. But it's still interesting to see that birds that are using these areas that are pretty relatively distant from the Chesapeake Bay are still coming in and using the Chesapeake Bay's resources. And here's a block by block, year by year portrayal of which location each tern was coming from. And you can see pretty drastic majority is Poplar Island throughout the 3 years, with the second most populous coming from ripraps, which is also, as would make sense, the shortest distance, at least by water, coming straight up from the South Bay to the location in St. Mary's. But we had a few other locations. So Poplar Island is a very important location for Maryland's seabirds. A lot of species that don't nest very frequently in the state are nesting on Poplar Island, especially seabirds, because this is a fairly mammalian free. They don't have, as far as I'm aware, there are no foxes that have made it to the island. There are still definite threats as far as nesting birds come, but it's in a very major restoration project using dredge material to rebuild a sinking island. And as you can see from this satellite imagery, the monumental difference that has happened in the past 2 decades with the Army Corps of Engineers and all the other people that are working on bringing this island back to its former size. Um, and of course, the terns have benefited greatly. So PFR banding began in 2013 as the nesting returned because when, as you can see, there's no habitat in 1997 left for terns to nest. They need open sand and no thick vegetation, or they won't use it as a nesting colony. So once the restoration of this island was uh, pretty far in, the terns returned to the location and began to make a nesting colony. And now it's grown significantly become the largest within the Maryland portion of the bay. And so here's a demographic of how many were banded each year that were seen to fledge, beginning in 2013 to 2023. And although there are gaps for 2023 or 2013 rather, there was, I believe, one nest, but the chicks were not seen to fledge successfully. So basically what this metric is all the birds that were banded in the nests on the island, minus those that were observed being predated or dying. So if the bird did not make it and was proven to have been a mortality, this would be subtracted from the total that were banded that year. And you can see a pretty substantial increase over the years with a pretty dramatic drop in 2023. And we'll get to why that happened. But overall, you can see that there's been a pretty sizable increase in nesting activity from common terns on the island. So the general life cycle of the common tern is like a lot of birds, it's fairly rapid how quickly they can develop. So within the matter of a couple months, and in the one summer season, chicks are hatched from eggs on ground nests and reared into juveniles that are capable of flight within just a few months. And once they are able to fly, they are still reliant on their parents to be fed, and they travel pretty far distances with their parents still giving them food. But once they reach that stage of being able to fly, they are presumed, if they were sighted after leaving the nest, they're presumed as fledged. So you can see this is on Poplar Island. The little chick hatches come from these little eggs, and the locations of the nests are monitored very closely. It's like, I believe, 3 times a day or 3 times a week rather. The nests are surveyed, and each one has data on whether it was refound, whether it was checked, and if the nests have been changed in any way, that the eggs have hatched and whatnot. And you can see that this is a juvenile that hasn't quite gotten the ability to fly, but is still running around on the island, and that would be considered a resighting and a fledged bird because it's left the nest location, even though it's still on the island. And here's another interesting thing that I came across is this individual while I was on Poplar Island helping with the banding. As a volunteer, I found this one that was banded. I took several photos of banded individuals, and then just a couple weeks later, in August, after being there in July, the same individual had come down to my survey spot at the fishing pier. And I thought that was pretty neat because it's easy to look at the map and say, okay, this bird's coming down from here. But seeing the same bird within a couple weeks in 2 different locations, I find that very interesting to see. But you can even see the same little light spot as he's molting out some of his feathers here. So that shows how they can travel that distance really quickly. But that the amount of time is not really showing how quickly, because it's about 50 miles. But anyway, so of the Poplar Island individuals, because we looked at how we have multiple locations, but the majority are Poplar Island. So of those individuals, these are the ages that they were basically the years that they were banded. So you can see that the numbers that were banded roughly align with the numbers that were observed on the pier. Uh, and I say roughly with an inference so roughly because especially 2021 is less reliable just because of the number of surveys. This was the discovery year, and I didn't consistently check the pier as much because I wasn't expecting to collect this data in the degree that I did. But still, you can see we have a larger number for 2018, which lines up with a decent peak in the development of the nest colony. But you'll also notice that there are no birds detected on the year prior to the survey year. So 2021 had none in 2020, 2022 had none in 2021, and 2023 had none in 2022. So this is an interesting point and shows some of the behavior, which is expected. Basically, terns after their first year will disperse from the nesting region and will stay in wintering grounds for the first year of their adult life or but their first year coming from the nesting colony. And they don't begin to return until the year after, once they've reached their third summer. And I thought that was very interesting, and it reflects perfectly with this data that none of the individuals would show up in those years. But after 2 years had passed, uh, let me see. Yeah, after 2 years had passed, you can see that at least in the case of 2020, 2020 birds show up the year after, and so on. And then 2021 years birds come the year after in 2023. But the next main point that we have for here is that there was a large drop in nesting success between 2022 and 2023. You can see we had 354 birds presumed to fledge in 2022, dropping to 14 in 2023. And that lines up very well with the numbers of juveniles that we saw on the pier between those 2 years. Like we had 133 on 2022 when there was a large number of successful fledging terns, and then only 3 in 2023 when there was only 14. Even though there was many more nests, there was a large number of nests, only 14 were presumed to be fledged or were seen and recorded as fledging. And the reason for that was high predation. One of which of the main predators that was to blame was great blue herons, which came into the colony in large numbers and were eating the chicks right out of the nest. And that was one of the big causes of why 2023 was a bad year. I think there are other predators as well, but they had put trail cams up and actually got the herons red-handed catching and eating tern chicks. So that was a pretty big loss for 2023. And I believe that the next year also was not as favorable as would have been hoped, but there's been measures to try to reduce this predation impact. So for the juveniles, we have the metrics of how many were total banded, which is the blue bar, which are those that were, well, not the total banded. Total banded is not including, this is not including those that were presumed or not presumed, were actually observed as being mortalities. So those that were known to fledge and those that did not have a observed fate is the blue bar. And more accurately would be those that were known fledge. So generally most of the birds that fledge would have been observed. And then finally is the gray bar, which is the number that were observed on Goose Creek Fishing Pier. And you can see that a fairly large amount of these juveniles are using this site in some point along their migration out of the bay. Even though only three of them were sighted on 2023, only 14 were known to have fledged. So that's still percentage wise not a small number, especially considering that they this is a tiny point. It's just a single pier that they're resting on, but it is indicating a broader use of the habitat around as fishing grounds. But still pretty interesting to see that one single structure has up to a third of the entire fledgling population of the entirety of the Poplar Island colony. Um, so one up to one third, and you'll see the metrics here that show this. Uh, yeah, so each year, how many we're seeing. And just to reiterate that here, we have the number that were each juveniles each year on the pier, and the percentage is up to 37% based on the confirmed fledging on this pier. So with this in mind, I bring up the idea of Goose Creek Fishing Pier as an important bird area. So typically, man-made structures aren't considered important bird areas, but for the sake of a thought experiment, we'll go through what it means to be an important bird area and whether or not Goose Creek Fishing Pier meets those criteria. So in Maryland Audubon, an important bird area is a site that provides essential habitat for one or more species of vulnerable birds. And there are four criteria that can make a site potentially qualify for that. So, number one is exceptional concentrations of regularly occurring birds. Two, significant populations of species of conservation priority. Three, bird species assemblages, characteristics of rare or representative habitats. And four, sites where long-term research generates high-quality data or value to conservation planning at a statewide scale. So for criteria one, we've got that. We've got large numbers of regularly occurring and less regularly occurring birds, including the common terns, royal terns, various gulls, cormorants, ospreys, etc. All are seen flocking on this pier. So that's checking box number one. Box number two is significant populations of species of high priority, which we've got both the common tern and royal tern is also listed as a rare breeder. And least tern is as well. So all three of those species are seen on the pier. Less so with the least terns, but they are occasional visitors on the pier. And then a site that can be used as long-term research, having this location to pick up birds after they're abandoned is useful to track their movements and is helpful to understanding better what they do after they leave the nesting colonies, and also helps to make more accurate judgments on the fledging success. So if, say, birds were presumed to, or we're not seen as fledging on the island itself, but then we're seen on this location, you could say, okay, that improves the certainty of the numbers of how many birds are actually surviving from these colonies, to see how successful they are at producing these young birds. And here you can see close up of both royal and common terns. So I didn't focus as much on the royal terns as I did the commons. But there were a fairly sizable number of royal terns over the 3 years that also were I reported from the pier, and that's at least over 100. I don't have the exact number, but it would be interesting to continue this study with the royal terns as well. But also, while I was on the survey time on this pier, I discovered some interesting behavioral observations. So many of the juveniles were still being fed by their parents, which suggests to me that the physical pier itself is useful as a place for chicks to sit and rest and continue to be fed without having threat of predation from any ground-based threats. So having this pier jut out into the open water with large numbers of other individuals, there's safety in numbers, and they can be continued to be fed by their parents while they still learn to gain their independence and catch food for themselves. Um, Preening was very, very frequent. Large numbers of these terns at any given time are preening themselves. Maintaining feathers is very important if you're a flying animal who needs to travel hundreds of miles, and having a location where they can sit without being harassed by any ground-based predators or being on the shoreline, which historically would have been where this sort of behavior would be occurring. But generally, human disturbance is much more common. And I should mention that Goose Creek Pier, I should have mentioned this earlier. Goose Creek Fishing Pier was condemned to the public beginning in 2022, the summer of 2022, because of storm damage. So it's basically undisturbed by the public. There's no people using it for fishing anymore. So it makes it very favorable to these birds because they're in a location that's over the water. They have a good vantage point to see any predators from any far distance, and they aren't disturbed by people like they are on the nearby Cedar Point, which flocks of terns will also congregate on. But because people sometimes walk there and their dogs go out there, it scares them off and it's less favorable. So because this pier is here, it seems to be useful to them as a place to stop and rest and make sure that they're in good condition. And also the social benefits may be another factor involved with these large groups. So I observed whenever an bald eagle flew over, the entire flock would get up in the air and swirl around in chaos. But whenever a osprey flew over, which was more frequent, there was no impact. They didn't react at all. So there's clearly they can tell the difference of what they're nervous of and what they're not. And I found that very interesting. Like pretty much, I mean, I don't have data on it specifically, so I can't validate this claim 100%. But from my observations, there's a clear difference between when an eagle flew over and when an osprey flew over, which to me seems like evidence that could be tied to group learning, that juveniles in this large flock can react to how other more seasoned terns are reacting to potential threats, with eagle as an example, which could potentially take tern as prey, and learn what to avoid and what not to avoid, and not to waste energy on flying every single time an osprey goes over. So, and of course, the benefit of safety in numbers, just having another bird watch your back while you're sitting there preening has benefits on its own. So that's another interesting point that I wanted to make about this location. So overall, I believe that the Goose Creek Fishing Pier is a important staging site for common terns in the Chesapeake Bay, especially those coming from Poplar Island, which is of course the largest nesting colony within the Maryland portion of the bay, and that human-made structures are potentially important to modern birds. We don't tend to think of man-made objects and structures as bird habitat, but the reality is they can play an important role, and I think that it should be researched more on how we can use this in our favor. And I mean, it's well known that nest islands are successful to producing nesting tern colonies, but also structures like a fishing pier, like an abandoned fishing pier, and even down at Point Lookout, the piers there are used by flocks of tern, and we've looked into seeing how many can be identified from there as well. But keeping an open mind of how human-made structures are impacting birds and their behaviors, because this is the Anthropocene, where a lot of human activity makes a lot of impact on the wildlife that shares this planet with us. So knowing how these interactions are both positive and beneficial, or negative and detrimental, can be useful in making conservation decisions regarding to these species. And also, as was covered before, it's a useful location to monitor the population of common terns within the Chesapeake Bay, as a place that we know that they are gathering, and we know that we can pick up banded individuals It's useful in tracking, how many of these birds are in the bay, how the trend is changing over time, and also just getting metrics on where individuals are coming from other banding stations outside the region or not, and what the makeup of the individuals that use this bay are. So the that's all I got for you guys. Anybody got questions for me? I appreciate your time and glad to answer anything if I can.
Ben, fascinating research and a great presentation. Thank you so much for sharing it with us. And if folks have questions, if you want to put them either in the chat box or you can just unmute yourself and ask away.
Thanks, Molly.
And let's see here. So I have one, Ben.
Mhm.
When you were watching them, do they tend to take off and migrate together? Like, do you see huge flocks of them taking off together, or what did you observe on that?
So generally, no, they would take off together when something spooked them. So when an eagle flew over, or also sometimes when like a helicopter or a large plane would go over, since it is an air station, they'd all like leave the perch and swirl around and then resettle back onto the pier. They aren't seeming to be flying in groups. No, it would be just individuals or family groups, like a parent with a couple chicks, or mostly they were coming by themselves. They weren't flying in flocks from my observations. But they definitely seem to flock with their own kind. So when there was royal terns, they'd be a couple royal terns together, and then a bunch of common terns and foresters terns, and then a couple more gulls and something else on the other end. So they seem to have preference with sticking with their species, but when they're traveling in, it's just they're coming from all directions because they're just fishing and then resting, and they don't seem to flock up from when I was watching them now.
Great, thank you. And just one other thing, and I'm sorry if you mentioned this, but when you were going over the points for the IBA, has it been declared an important bird area, or is it in the process, going through the process right now?
So no, it is not in the process, and it has not been declared. At one point, I think there had been talk of declaring parts of Pax River as important bird area, but because its primary function is as an air station, it's not um likely to happen. So no, it's not proposed as an important bird area, but I'd like to see maybe not this location. I mean, I would like to see this protected as a IBA, but as it stands, no, no, it hasn't been officially or otherwise um, classified as such. Though I think it's useful to think about, as man-made structures aren't really typically thought of as IBAs, and that's maybe something that will change in the future as if more sites like this are talked about in the literature. So that was
And
my hope to
especially
bring.
if some of their nesting sites are disappearing, like this one theirs originally was.
Mhm.
So we have another question here. Good question. How do you get so close to read the bands without the terns flying away?
So I have this camera, Nikon B700, if anybody's interested. It's very good. It's got 60 times zoom, which does I can pretty much get any turn on the pier, with the exception of those on the very end, if I am standing on the middle of it. But honestly, a lot of these turns, I feel like they recognized me after going on there as much as I did, and were fairly bold, though the zoom, without having a good zoom, it wouldn't have been possible. But the camera that you can see on my neck here is the same one that I used to get all these photos, actually. And um, yeah, generally they seem to be fairly tolerant of me going on the pier once a day, or a couple times a day if it was large numbers. And I mean, that also might be partly related to the fact that they are on a highly managed colony that are surveyed multiple times a week and banded at their nests. Um, may or may not have an impact on whether they're tolerant of a person. But honestly, they generally, I tried not to spook them as much as I could, but generally they were mostly tolerant. Like they won't let you get like within arm's length of them. But I think just the repetition of surveying that pier helped to they kind of became accustomed to it and weren't. I moved really slowly and I zoomed in with the camera and just kind of go from foot to foot, and they generally are pretty tolerant of that. So
And we have another question, starting with a comment that this was a great presentation.
thank
Did
you.
you see or track other interesting birds while doing this study?
So yes, to a lesser extent, I didn't focus on them in the study itself, but I did get band returns for a lot of royal terns, which were at the pier itself, but also some other locations where the common terns weren't flocking to, which includes the Cedar Point, Point Patience over near Solomon's at the rec center, that big strip of sand you can see from the bridge. There was a lot of them there, which we actually had an article about one that I picked up that was 6 months from the oldest ever recorded for the species for royal terns. So that was pretty neat to find. And also the pound nets. You'll see a lot of any pound net that I've come across around Southern Maryland. You'll see royal terns during that time of year, and I'd go out with a paddleboard and get close enough with the camera to get the band numbers, and yeah, it's pretty high numbers from doing that. And the demographics of them, I didn't go nearly as in depth, but the vast majority of those are from Rip Raps Island, which is at the bridge tunnel near that, where the mouth of the James River in Virginia. So it's in the Chesapeake Bay section of Virginia, and a lot of those, as you saw before, there was the common terns. Most of them were from Poplar Island, but the second most common location was Rip Raps. That's where the majority of the royal terns were coming from, because royal terns don't nest at Poplar, um, but they nest. They have very big colony in, at least for the region, in Rip Raps Island. And as far as other species that were banded, I had one laughing gull that was also from Rip Raps, and interestingly, a sandwich tern, which had come from southern North Carolina. I don't know the exact location, but it was in North Carolina. And which was interesting about that was, sandwich tern is not a common bird for the Chesapeake region. They're an uncommon but not unexpected rarity. But we had that one year, which was I think 2022. There was five or so different sandwich turds showed up, and what was interesting was the banded one had a chick with it or juvenile with it, which I assume came from that. If it was nesting the same location where it was banded before, it had come from North Carolina with a juvenile within, you know, uh, probably a month or so of the juvenile learning to fly. Which I can't validate that that's definitely where it was nesting, but they don't nest anywhere close. Well, close is a relative term, but at least not as close as the other two species. So it was interesting to see that even the sandwich terns were coming up the bay and using this location as maybe not the same way as the common terns as they're coming south, but at least as a location to get food uh before the winter season. So,
And
but
we have a question from Lisa Garrett, who's the president of Prince George's Audubon. And
mhm.
she says, when she was at conservation camp at Hog Island, we built tern nesting shelters to protect nesting young from weather and predators. Is this something that Poplar Island might do?
So from my experience going to Poplar Island, I have not heard of that, but I don't know much about the future plans. But that's interesting to know. I wasn't aware that they built structures for the nest themselves, like around to protect them from predators, because that would
And
be
we
interesting.
built small wooden boxes that were
Hmm.
a lid and two sides, and they were put over the nest after the nests were established. And their main predator was great horned owls,
Ah,
so they had to
interesting.
protect them from above.
So the terns, when they come to the nest, do they come from the sides?
Yes, and
And
flew around and smacked into us and attacked us when we were putting the platforms out there.
uh, so that's interesting. No, I haven't seen that being done in Poplar, but um, yeah, that's interesting. Um,
They
but
also had to get a
I
wrangler to come and get ready to trap the great horned owls.
say what they were trying to trap the
They
great
got a
horned owls.
wrangler. Yeah, he came from the Barrier Islands down along Nassauanga, along the eastern shore, Barrier
Hmm.
Islands, and he had trapped great horned owls. So they brought him up there to trap great horned owls and to talk to us about. He would trap them, and he said he relocated them
Hmm.
from.
That is interesting. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if that could be done with the threats on Poplar. I don't know. I think they had predation from an owl. I don't think it was great horn though. They actually did have a nest of short-eared owls. I don't think that's what would pick a couple of them off. But from what I was finding was the majority of predation was coming from great blue herons and black crowned night herons. And the night herons nest on the island as well. And uh, apparently their population has been increasing. And this last year in 2024, they were a big issue with predation. So I wonder if a similar thing that prevent great horned owls from predating would work for a night heron.
Maybe they can
That's an
reach out
interesting thing,
To Hog Island
huh?
and find out get some of the plans and listen and talk to them about it.
Yeah, that'd be really neat. I'm actually gonna be meeting with one of the other guys that worked on the paper version of this project with me on Friday, so I'll definitely bring that up. He works with Poplar Island more closely than I do. Um, I'll that's I appreciate you mentioning that because I'd like to know more. That's pretty cool.
All right. Well, thank you, Ben. This was very interesting. It's cool that someone's doing this research right in our own backyards.
Yeah, yeah, I appreciate you for coming and listening. You know, I'm nothing without people to talk to, and I'm glad to have an audience that is as passionate about birds as I am. So that's good to see.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. And then, so two questions here from Linda. Wondering what the impetus to rebuild the island was. Was it the bird or the Naval Air Station needs? And then the second question is, what is the typical number of eggs per nest? And do we know the average survival rate?
So for the question about the island, um, Poplar Island has a lot of history, and I can't say that I know a ton about it. But Poplar Island isn't associated with the air station. That's a wholly different thing. The Army Corps of Engineers, I know, is a big proponent of the plan to rebuild the island. And it's a combination of putting the dredge material for the Baltimore shipping channel into use, which is the basis of building this island. So it's a combination between using a waste resource and for the purpose of conservation for birds. So it's kind of a double whammy, and it's been very successful in doing both. Uh, but it's not associated with the air station. The air station is in St. Mary's, whereas the Poplar Island is in the northern part of the bay. It's past the Bay Bridge. And I don't know what county it counts as, but it's across from like St. Michael's, if that helps at all. Um,
Ben, I
and
put the link to the Poplar Island restoration page.
perfect.
Put it into
That
the
could
chat.
talk about it better than I can. That's perfect.
Because
Yeah, but Poplar Island is an amazing thing if anybody's interested.
From North Beach, you can see Poplar Island and you can see them doing the work out there all the time.
Yeah.
It's also a great
It's
terrapin location,
huh?
Diamondback terrapin location.
Yeah, that's true. They have a big terrapin program. I actually remember when I was in third grade, they brought terrapins from Poplar Island and had them raised in the classroom, and they still are doing that. And it's Poplar Island really is in my opinion, one of the coolest places in Maryland, at least in the Bay. Like, I mean, what a great accumulation of like using a waste resource and helping wildlife at the same time. I think we can learn a lot about that. And I'm very fascinated with how that ties into this uh, research with the terns on Pax River. And what can I ask what was the follow-up second
Yeah,
part of the
it was,
question?
what is the typical number of eggs per nest? And do we know the average survival rate?
Average survival rate, I don't have that metric off the top of my head. Though it's probably less than I don't want to say any number that I don't know. I can't say to the survival rate, but it really depends on how much predation is happening. So it's case by case. But the number of eggs, I think they can get up to four, but generally it's three or two. The clutch sizes aren't more than four, at least not that I've seen. But my experience is not as in depth as people that are banding this, at the banding station more than I was. But I don't believe they're much more than four if that ever happens. Generally, it's three or two.
And Teresa asked that you mentioned that something was put in place to help protect the terns from the herons. Can you tell us what that was?
So I don't know about what was done. I think they have permits to like take birds that are harassing the colony. But yeah, I don't work at Poplar Island, so I don't know exactly what they have in place. Um, but I think they had trail cams set up to try to figure out what was predating on the terns. And I think at this point they're trying to find measures for the year coming next because it's become such a problem the last 2 years to figure out what's going on. But I don't know what the plans are. My research is more just focused on them coming to the pier itself because most of I went and volunteered a couple times to see what was going on at the colony, but there's people that could give you better information than I can about that.
Yeah, and here's a great comment from Linda to show you how the far reach here. She's viewing from New Mexico.
Oh wow.
Thank you, Linda. Alice has a question. I don't know if you mentioned this, but when do birds get banding? Where do you upload the data um, of where they appear and how abundant are the data from anyone who does a survey about those birds' movements?
So for like the location that they're banded or when they're banded or where the
Uh,
information's stored.
I guess when she's asking when the birds get banded, and
Okay.
then where do you upload the data about that banding?
So the birds are banded, at least the terns I can speak to. Um, on the nesting colonies, Poplar Island, which is where I actually have the most knowledge about. They are banded once they are at least a couple days from hatching at the age that they're able to be banded. They're banded on site directly in the nest on the colony on Poplar Island. And the data is recorded uh, with the band number and everything on data sheets. And then that is transferred into the USGS banded bird banding laboratory that holds that data. And so if you're asking when you report a band with a PFR code, you send the location, you send the date and the code itself, and then that goes into the system that the bird was identified, and you'll receive information back of where that bird was originally banded. And so that's all held in the USGS bird banded laboratory. They have a big database that holds that information. And when they're banded is depending on how old they are. Basically, the nests are surveyed throughout the nesting season, and when chicks are found that are of the size to be banded, they are banded on site, and they're given both one federal band and the PFR band that's associated with that. The PFR band is the one that's readable with the camera without catching the bird, whereas the federal band, which is used for most other banding operations, has the I don't know how many digits it is. It's four, and then it's five. I think it's 9 digits. Um, and that is useful too if you catch the bird, but because there's a PFR associated with that banding federal band, you're able to get the information for either band for that bird because it's each PFR is unique to one federal band. Does that answer the question?
I think it sounds like it does. So, Ben, thank you so much for this presentation. The research is just fascinating, and your presentation was terrific. And I want to thank everybody for joining tonight. This was a great group, and this recording will be posted on our website in a few days if you want to tell other friends about it. This talk and all of our monthly talks are archived on our website. So thank you all for joining. And Ben, thank you so much for taking the time to do this presentation and sharing the research with us.
Thank you. Thanks, Molly. And thanks everybody for coming and joining this presentation and being a great audience. I wish I could see all your faces and it was in person so I could shake your hand. But thanks for joining, and I hope you enjoyed it. And hope you all have a good night.